Grief isn't the end of your story, it's the beginning of a new chapter. Welcome back to another episode of the Empowered Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamoni, and I'm a grief and empowerment coach, author, and creator of the Empowered Grief Journey coaching platform. Each episode features real conversations with people from around the world who have navigated profound loss and found the strength to rebuild their lives with courage and intention. Together, we'll explore what it means to move from survival to integration, to reclaim your identity, honor grief, and create a future grounded in truth, resilience, and purpose. If you're walking through loss and wondering what comes next, you're not alone. Walk with us as we transform grief into growth, one story at a time. Today, I have an amazing guest with us. Her name is Devorah Brinckerhoff. She is a mixed media artist and transformational guide with more than 30 years of experience. She's trained at RISD and formerly gallery represented. She developed the soul portrait process, an innovative creative practice that helps people transform trauma and life challenges into empowerment through art. Drawing from her own experiences of profound loss and family estrangement, Deborah now leads workshops, guides individuals in creating healing practices, and creates commissioned soul portraits from her studio in Oregon, helping people reconnect with their authentic power. I'm very excited, by the way, to introduce her on the show because we never really have talked about art and the process of grief on this podcast. And so I'm very excited to open up this new modality for you guys as listeners to see that there's another avenue for us to work through healing in our grief process through the means of art. So without further ado, Devorah, thank you for jumping on the podcast today.
Hey, Chris, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Likewise. And I'm also excited to have somebody from the PNW on the show because I'm up in Gig Harbor, Washington. And I remember you were down in Portland, if I remember right.
Ah, yep. I love it up here. I mean, we were in Utah for over 23 years and going from straight sun to these winters, this is much more my speed, so I like it.
That's a drastic difference in climate.
It really is. Yeah, it really is.
Well, Devorah, as I usually let most of my guests know when we start the podcast, I love to just have you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your grief journey that led you to where you are today.
I had sort of a slow burn grief journey. I think that my early childhood was actually filled with grief, but I had no way to name it or even uh, understand it in any way. And drawing and painting really allowed me an outlet for that. I just didn't know it. And then as my life improved, I was always still drawing and painting, but it improved on the surface, not at a deep internal level. And so I have an early childhood sexual abuse history and really discovered that when I got pregnant with my first child. And that led me down a road of it's a different kind of grief, right? You're grieving for um, unknowingness, I think. Sort of who would I be without this experience? Grief of identity. But really, things fell apart when we discovered that our own children were being sexually abused by a different family member. And when that came to the surface, it caused such a disruption in both sides of our family that we were sued by our parents for grandparent rights, and within 24 hours, lost everyone close to us, brothers and sisters, parents, aunts, uncles, cousins. And all of a sudden, we just became this like little life raft of a family of five instead of an extended family of, over 30 people. And I did not know what to do with myself. I did not understand what was happening in the sense that when we needed family the most, they left. And so I thought that there must be something really, really, really terribly wrong with us instead of the other way around. So that was something that I needed to unpack. And the only way that I knew how to unpack that was with artwork and creating. That's how soul portraits were made.
That's a that's a really beautiful story that's born out of tragedy. And I I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that you found out about your abuse later on in life. Was that in your teenage years or was that in your 20s?
That I found that
How,
I like that it came to the surface. I was 32 when I got pregnant for the first time. And so that history played itself out in very unconscious ways, in extremely unhealthy relationships, in placing myself in dangerous situations, in feeling like my role in the world was to please others and become whoever they needed me to be. I was very good at reading a room and meeting people wherever they were. And so that's a really early survival technique, right? So to be able to know what's coming at you and to make yourself whatever is needed in order to stay safe. But some of those things that I perceived that I needed to do to stay safe were really not only unhealthy, they caused me a lot of shame and guilt. And so I had terrible self-esteem, which then becomes this like vicious cycle that the worse you feel about yourself, the more you attract really dangerous people into your life, the more you feel like I'm a horrible person, and around it goes. And I ended up, living in Europe and just making really bad choices and coming to a curb out in the middle of nowhere in the middle of winter in Prague and being like, if I don't get up from this curb, I will die just because of the elements, right? It was freezing cold. I wasn't dressed. And I wasn't sure, right? Like it really occurred to me that I could just lay back in this snowbank and that would be that. And I, in that moment, recognized that I think I had been putting myself in situations that would be taken care of for me. So people that were just really, really dangerous and prone to violence. And I just kept getting myself out of those, into those situations and then out of those situations until I ended up on this curb. And I was like, well, really just faced with a black and white choice. And I got back up and I walked and walked and walked. The buses then, right, there were payphones, but who I didn't know who to call. I mean, not payphones. Yeah, pay phone booths, right? That's all that was there. And I just walked. I walked and walked and walked and then back to my friend's house who drove me back into town. And I vowed to myself that I was going to make different choices and start caring for myself in a way that really sort of turned the trajectory of my life around. And it was a vow that I've kept, which was really to be honest with who I was and what was underneath all of these beliefs about myself. That was the beginning. And shortly thereafter, I met and fell in love with my husband. And I think I was 22 or 23 in Prague, and or maybe 24. And I met my husband when I was 25. And then we got married uh, really 5 years later and started a family. And starting a family opened up a whole nother can of worms. So that early childhood sexual abuse was kind of leading the show from the background at a cellular level, but I really had no idea. It was pre-verbal, pre everything. I don't have any cognitive memories, but I have a lot of body memories. And so those body memories were leading my life. And I didn't understand why my life was going so poorly until it really came to the surface. And you feel like it's getting worse when this comes up, but it also in a way was such a relief because it made my life make sense. Uh, and I could start working with therapists who really knew what they were talking about when it came to unpacking sexual abuse and the kind of insidious ways that leads you, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a very unconscious um, survival. I was like in conscious survival for a long time and then got pregnant. I was so excited, right? I couldn't wait to have a child. I had wanted to have a child my whole life. And then all of a sudden I was pregnant. I'm like, oh my God, I cannot have this foreign object inside my body. And my body was screaming in panic. And I didn't know why. And so it took another 10 years to figure out, like, I got more and more information as I was unpacking that. But within that, within my own story of just what is this and how do I understand what my body is trying to tell me, I as I gained more information and gained my footing, our children started, we had a son by then, and he started acting out in this way that I was just like, this is really um like something is wrong. Like something is very, very wrong. And it took another 3 years to figure out what was going on, and then let alone who it was. And when we discovered who it was, we decided, like, we can't bury this. If we bury this truth, we're just doing the same thing that I had grown up with, and I refuse to do that. Like, we have children, it's our job to keep them safe. But when we let the family know, which was on the my husband's side, it blew up. Everything just blew up. And at first it seemed like it was going to be okay, but within 24 hours, it wasn't. And that, I think, just is an indication of how uncomfortable people are with sexual violence, sexual abuse. They need it not to be talked about, and they need it to be good. Like, they need to delineate people into, they can't do this, right? If we love this person, then they can't we can't say this about them, right? Like, then they'll be all bad, right? We want to put the people who create or cause sexual harm, or really any harm, we want to say, well, they're bad, and the bad people look like this, and you can see them coming because this is what they wear, and this is how they act, and this is what they say, and so stay away from those people. And it's just not the way it works, right? We're dynamic people, and we all cause harm and we all receive harm. And how do we really open up the conversation so that we don't keep perpetuating harm? Because when it goes underground, or we pretend it didn't happen, then it comes out sideways. And I spent the first 30 years having it come out sideways, and the next 30 years, I'm not quite that old yet, but sort of really learning how to integrate that we're all of it, right? We have good and bad in all of us. And how do we accept that in one another and really talk about the things that cause so much pain and suffering? It's all survival, right? Like, people get hurt, and they want to protect themselves, and they learn certain things early on, and they stick with it, right? Like, I learned that this works, so I'm going to keep doing it regardless of the fallout. Um, and so my work is really all about, like, unpacking that fallout and making sure that people have a way to talk about what is considered unspeakable. And that's why creating art for me was such a powerful tool, because I didn't have to say any words. I didn't have to make sure that I wasn't going to be sued for, like, defamation, or, like, speaking poorly of others. I could let my materials speak for me. I could let the artwork speak for me, and start letting this out of my body, because that's where grief lives. It lives in our body, and it loves to hide in these sneaky places, and then it comes out in ways that we don't anticipate. There is no anticipation. Grief has a life of its own. It's an energy that I felt like I needed to follow. It wasn't anything I could capture, right? Like, I would pin it down and understand its shape for a moment, and then it would shift on me, and I'd have to learn it all over again. And so to be able to kind of ebb and flow with grief, and let it speak, right? It has a very powerful, strong, necessary voice and energy that I really believe needs to be respected, and given room for expression.
Well, Devorah, I want to say a big thank you for what you just shared in the last 15 minutes because that's exactly why this podcast exists. You touched on many things that we'll talk about here as we go forward, but the most important one that you drew out is that when we don't hold space for grief, and society has trained us, don't look over there, hide it away, push it under the carpet, it's going to come up at some point. And a lot of times, what you alluded to, which has happened to me, it's happened to a lot of people I've talked to, is that when we choose to ignore it, it starts to run in the background. It runs automatic. And so a lot of times we go through life and circumstances, situations, relationships, and we're not consciously aware of it, but those things are running in the background for us. And that's where a lot of times we might say we made a mistake or bad decision or bad relationship. Well, it wasn't necessarily our fault because there was unconscious process grief underneath this thing running the boat, and we just didn't know about it. And I love that you shared that when you got pregnant the first time, all of a sudden your body starts reacting. That's another big part people miss is that our body and our mind are two different entities, and sometimes they talk together, sometimes they operate separately. And for us to allow ourselves to understand that when our body starts acting out of line or out of normal, stop and process and don't say, "Oh, I have a problem," or "Oh, I'm this." No, ask yourself, what's causing me to feel this way? What might be running in the background that I'm not consciously aware of right now, or what kind of trauma or abuse did I go through in my life that might be creeping up in this moment right now that's being triggered by what I'm seeing. And I think that gives us an opportunity to explore our grief in a safe, healthy way, but reconnect and reintegrate the parts of our mind and our body together.
Yeah. Our bodies are so wise, and I grew up in a very educated scientific modality where we trust the mind, we don't trust the body. And I needed to flip that and trust the body and let my body really it is integrating them and inviting them to work together, not one or the other. It's that same thing. There's no like, oh, it's all the body and it's not the mind. It's all the mind and not the body. They have to work together. We're designed to work together. Um, it's a the translation. How do we translate what we use our mind, or I try and use my mind to translate the wisdom of my body, and that that knowing in the body is really where I learned how to rest in its knowledge. And those are where the answers are, and to train my mind to trust my body kind of thing.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your story. You mentioned that after going through this abuse, there was an almost immediate estrangement with family. The reason I want to ask about this is estrangement from family has been something I've seen happen a lot in the last year. It's something that I think is very much on the rise, and people don't really understand how to deal with that or how to process it or how to even understand it at that point, and let alone understand how they feel about it. What was it like for you going through that process of estrangement? And did you find yourself, feeling lost and confused or not understanding things? Or did it give you kind of a breakaway to reconnect with yourself and process what had happened and give yourself an opportunity to grow from that? What was that experience like for you?
So it could have gone, so we always have a choice, right? There was a complete rejection from my family and my husband's family. And I love my family, right? And I had always loved them. I didn't always feel loved by them. And when I got a letter of excommunication and legal papers with for grandparent rights, I was shocked, right? I was so surprised. Uh, and devastated. I felt like I was walking around with a gaping hole in my center. I didn't know who I was without my family, and it was extremely confusing because I really needed them, right? So I wanted my parents to support me as a parent. So to my own children, I didn't know how to navigate the waters. All I knew was that I had given birth to these innocent, beautiful babies, and they were being hurt, and that they were my priority. and they'll always be my priority. So it didn't make sense to me. I was very naive in thinking that I would always be my parents' priority, and those two things did not add up. And so that was very confusing. It was very hurtful, right? So instead of talking to me about what was going on, they were really scared. And it just it speaks volumes to what they're not able to look at within themselves. And in order to unpack that loss, I was in my studio, and so it gets really hard for me to kind of tease out, Chris, so I apologize. But and how to talk about this in a succinct way. But essentially, like my abuse, I was understanding it and moving through that. I was several years into that process when we discovered what was going on with our kids. So my family did not know about my own history. I did not tell them because I was afraid of what they would say and what they would do. But I did tell my husband's family. And when the abuse came out and was connected to somebody in that family, in my husband's family, my husband's father called up my father and said, "This is what your daughter is saying about your family. And and you need to join this lawsuit against her." And instead of calling me and asking me about it, they did. They just did. And so I didn't know any of that happened until I was served papers. And somewhere in the ether, I had this feeling about how it happened. And when those papers came, that was confirmed. It was validated about how my husband's family called up my family and then called up every single person that we knew and sort of lambasted us. So you're asking me how I worked through that. I first had to really ask, like, am I as bad as they think I am? And I did not want to look at that. I didn't want to look at any of this. It was so uncomfortable for me because it confirmed my earlier intrinsic belief that I was bad, that I was unworthy, that I was someone of no value unless I was pleasing somebody else. So it was devastating on so many different levels because I felt like all of the terrible things that I had tried to hide away from inside of myself were being confirmed. And I painted about it, right? Like I painted about it. And then until I actually opened up a box of love letters and hate letters and photographs from my family and the lawsuit and the letter of excommunication. And I was revisiting it all and ripping it up and gluing it down on a canvas. And I was letting those materials be representative of their voices, all of their voices, the good and the bad of what was being said, what was being perceived, what was being acted on. I just let all of those materials speak for me. And I also made them more digestible. And underneath all of that love and hate, there was a lot of anger and hurt, mine included. Um, it's the question of who am I underneath this experience? And then who am I underneath this other experience? And I just kept going, like, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Underneath all of these people's beliefs about me, what do I believe about me? And that's the growth that you're talking about that comes if we let grief work with us, if we work with grief and not against it, when we allow it to really land in our body and ask the question, what is this here for? How do I hold this? It's such a grief can be so sharp, right? It can, if we let it, it can really cut us down. It can keep us down. And it can show us the deepest beauty that lives within each of us if we allow it. And we're so afraid of grief. We're so deeply, deeply afraid that it will consume us. And in deep grief, there are definitely moments of being consumed. And that it needs to be, right? Like to really feel the fullness of the power of grief, because on the other side of it, something else, it broadens our capacity to love and for beauty. Um, And so I try and describe it. It just is like an integration. We're not just the darkness. Like grief has a lot of darkness, but it's not all darkness, right? Within grief, there is the most incredible bright light, because when you're sitting with deep grief, the only way through it, and really through it, is with your own core of self-love. Like that is, for me, that is what I found. I found an ember of love that rested inside of me, deep, deep down underneath all of these stories about myself and all of this perception and misunderstanding and hurt and pain and shame. And I found that I was the only one who needed to understand. I was the only one who could understand. I was the only one that could forgive myself. I couldn't ask anybody else to do that. I wouldn't trust anybody else, right? There was no way that if I was looking externally, no one could hold my grief for me. I had to. And in doing that, I found out who I really was. And the tool that got me there was art. And it had always been there by my side, always, always, always nudging me to the truth of myself. And that is what grief gave me. It gave me love. It gave me who I am underneath all the lived experience of grief. And what comes out of denying a deeper trauma or deeper grief is love.
So tell me a little bit about your artwork because I've found when I do art, there's, different thoughts and emotions and feelings that come out of that process as you're going along. I don't know if you necessarily paint or do other forms of things, but tell me a little bit about when you're in that art environment, when you're in that place of just focusing on creation. How has that allowed you to work through trauma? How has it allowed you to work through thoughts or feelings or emotions or even things that people have said about you in your past? And how's that allowed you to work through those?
Well, any form of creativity to me is access to divinity. And I never would have said that before. Like religion or spirituality was not something that I grew up with, and it was almost shameful to even talk about it. Um, I feel like creativity essentially turns the channel from the thinking mind into the body's wisdom and intuition. Um, and so creativity was always telling me things that I didn't recognize. Looking back, I'm like, oh, wow. It was always nudging me towards what my body had known for decades. Decades. In college, I made a lampshade with a clipping of a dead woman on the outside. And it was a long process, but essentially when you look at it, there's a dead woman and she's been discarded, but I made the images repeat in a way that when you first look at it, it looks like a dancing figure. It looks like paper dolls. So it's quite innocent in appearance until you get closer. And when you turn the light on, there are images of me growing up as a young child with my family. And then other images of like violence. And I was like, wow. So when I made this lampshade, I had no idea, like no idea about my history of sexual abuse. And to me, when I turn on, I look at it now and I still have it. Um, I I knew I look at it and it's just telling my story for me. So it was a way creativity allowed all of this part of me that I wasn't ready to look at yet that making that lampshade was so fun. I wasn't upset. I wasn't traumatized. I was clueless and I wasn't ready. And that was the power of creativity for me. Like it was always telling me the truth, but until I was ready to see it, know it, feel it, I it met me where I was. And so there wasn't any danger. It wasn't like somebody was forcing this information on me. So I really believe that creativity meets you wherever you are, and it's a tool to understand yourself at a deeper level. And so I am by training an oil painter, very like I very classic, just oil paint on canvas, but mixed media has always been in the background. And when I started working with my own materials, that really became like it joined the two parts of creativity from the conscious to the and the unconscious became one. And so that while I'm in the creative space, it quiets my thinking mind and allows the wisdom to come through on the canvas. And so that is just a powerful tool to get to the places that are stuck, the energy that's stuck in our bodies that we aren't aware of yet without it being scary, if that makes sense, right? And I think that when we tell our story, at least for me, it kept me in my brain, it kept me thinking, and it also kept the pattern going. When I'm in my body, it like released the energy without my brain even having to know it until I was ready. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense because I think when we allow ourselves, like you brought up with your example, to get into that creative space, we let loose of a lot of the parameters we set upon us. Particularly when we're told we're this kind of person or that kind of person, or we're told that we did X or we did Y. We have a lot of external input flying at us. And when we're in that creative space, it quiets that all down so that we can actually bring our conscious mind and our unconscious mind of who we are
Yep.
up to the forefront. And
Yep.
that allows us to really immerse ourselves in that for once without any kind of judgment or preconceived notions, things like that, but just to simply be.
Yep.
You're reminding me of a book I read a long time ago called The Untethered Soul. And it was a very powerful book, by the way, but I will say that it really got to the core in the first part. It drove me nuts when I first read it because it said, you're not all these titles you give yourself. You're not an artist. You're not a podcaster. You're not a coach. You're not this. You're not that. And so, well, then who the hell am I? Like,
Right.
and so, but as I got through the book, I started realizing we're always defining ourselves by these things that people say to us, feel about us, think about us, but we never really get down to who are we as a person.
Right.
And I think when we allow ourselves, as you've described with doing artwork, that's the outlet that gives a lot of us that place to shed all those things from the external environment to allow our full true self to come forward. And for some people, that can be very scary because we do live a lot of times in what other people think about us, and we don't give ourselves an opportunity to come to the surface and truly meet ourselves.
That's the power of it for me. And I don't think I ever would have met myself if A, grief hadn't happened, and B, I didn't have creativity. Because it really does ask you, who am I underneath all these labels? And we're never what other people say about us, ever. And we're not even what we say about ourselves, right? It's all learned. It's all learned. It's all conditioning. And creativity gave me an opportunity to really question that truth. Like, what is true underneath it without all the labels? And the labels don't really serve us, even if they are prestigious or uh, fit us in nicely to what society loves. They're just a label. They're not who we really are. And it's very powerful to know who you really are underneath those. That to me is true empowerment. Who are you without the labels, without anything external? If you strip everything away, who are you? And I really believe we are only love, but it takes a while
I,
to get there.
Yeah, and I think that's a hard path, especially when you go through grief or trauma or even sexual abuse like you went through. That's very hard to get to that place to see that. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily hold compassion or understanding for that because those are topics of society and things that happen in society that we don't I was reading a book called The Body Keeps Score. It's a very interesting book, and something that this guy doctor talked about in the book was the ideology that we don't want to necessarily believe that this is possible. We don't want to believe that this happens to other people. We don't even want to believe that our own family members or people around us, coworkers, would even do something like that. It's almost we set ourselves up with this expectation that it's unfathomable to think this could happen.
Right.
And he talked about how that belief system, by the way, triggers more trauma. It triggers a body response in us, by the way, when we allow ourselves to even accept that and not give ourselves the opportunity to understand that there are people out there that do things like that. It's part of the world. There's darkness just as much as light. There's also these areas of grief and trauma that we need to actually discuss. We need to actually talk about. We can't just always run from it and say it doesn't happen or it doesn't exist or, well, it did, but I don't want to talk about it. We've got to walk away from that and say, that when we allow ourselves to explore these things further in our trauma healing work that we do, we allow the body to be heard for once. And now this thing that's kind of caged in and trapped now starts to feel released. It starts to feel heard and seen and understood is what I like to call it. And that gives us the opportunity that I've heard you share today on today's episode of really finding out who is Devorah and what's love look like for her. And I love your story of your healing work that you've done from that. You're a beautiful person for taking that journey.
Thanks, Chris.
So I wanted to ask you another big question. You said that, right around 32, you got pregnant for the first time. You were also going through a lot of trauma work at that point. Was in many ways getting pregnant one of the big stepping stones for you in your healing journey? And what did healing look like for you in that 10, 15, 20 years after that?
Yes, getting pregnant really opened up Pandora's box and it was not comfortable. And a lot of what you're talking about isn't comfortable. Like that denial, when people are afraid, they deny it. And again, that says, well, we have to delineate the good people from the bad people, and it's impossible. You can't do it. That's what's happening, in the world right now. It just at the end of the day, it doesn't work. So getting pregnant it was a wonderful thing, and it also, yeah, it opened up this door that I could again have a choice. Like, do I actually look into this or do I deny it? And for me, I couldn't deny it. Like I just couldn't deny it. It was too big, it was too powerful, and uh it started the questions, right? Like what is going on? Because why am I so scared? Why am I so freaked out? Like I just freaked out. And that was my body, right? It was my body being like, yeah, there is something wrong here and you must pay attention. But we don't think getting pregnant is wrong. It's supposed to be a celebration. And it was also really confusing then to have a baby. And that had its own triggers because I was so unbelievably protective of her, and I wouldn't let her out of my sight to a level of it became that was unhealthy, and it it just told another story. Like there's why, right? Like I just kept asking why. And that's really like being pregnant didn't say, oh, I was sexually abused. It took years for me to really understand um, what was going on. It was very confusing.
Well, I think it's a beautiful way that life kind of leads us on these paths, is what I've come to find on my own grief journey. And I read a book one time recently about a lady that her book is called Why Some People Heal and Why Other People Don't. And it was a very powerful book that some people might take radically. I took it very open-minded because it was very deep in things. And she gave examples of people who were incest survivors, people that went through massive trauma and never felt seen or heard or even had a place to work through that. And something that I think is so brave is when you said getting pregnant was very triggering, your body just started reacting constantly.
Yeah.
That's a sign trauma is not being seen and heard. It's been suppressed for a long time, and now it's got a chance to say something. But also, when you have a child, your whole mind state shifts, your whole body shifts, and that shifting is an opportunity. And she talked a lot about in this book where we see illness or events like this in particular, and we think it's a bad thing that's happening. You brought up a lot how grief can be very uncomfortable at times. And we're all scared of uncomfortableness. You know, when we get an illness, we run to the doctor like, fix it, fix it, fix it. Give me a pill, give me this. I don't want to feel this way. And unfortunately, our healing, by the way, is in that very uncomfortable, painful place. As weird as that sounds, that environment is actually the thing that's going to heal us. And so instead of running away from it or trying to avoid it or push it out or suppress it like a lot of us do,
Right.
sitting in that uncomfortableness can be a huge opportunity for us to just simply get to that place, like you said, of who am I and what does love mean to me and how can I love myself more, even though I've been through these moments of life.
Yeah, and to not deny them, right? And I agree. I love Bissell's book, Body Keeps the Score, and I love what this woman is saying that there's an opportunity, and if we jump in with both feet, we're expanding, right? And so if we let it define us, that's when we don't get back up. If we ask who am I underneath the experience, we're going to find that we're bigger than the experience. We're always bigger than the experience, but it's a distortion when we believe that we're not. And it's a totally understandable distortion. Like I was really there. Um, and it doesn't have to define us. When we let it define us, that's when it becomes very, very difficult to get back up. And I don't blame anybody who doesn't get back up. It makes sense to me. I'd like to support people as much as possible in knowing that they're bigger than whatever they've lived through. Um, yeah, so there's a huge opportunity in it, but it is very uncomfortable. And I think the discomfort now I just see as a really good sign. And resistance, I think, is a really good sign. Like you're right at the edge of it. And so if you just allow for that, if you're in the resistance or in the discomfort for just a moment longer, who do you become? You become stronger, you become more resilient, you expand. It's a beautiful thing. But we have to understand what's happening, right? And not panic. In the panic, like you said, we run to the doctor, we run to a therapist, or and then, we run into the therapist's biases and so like then their voice becomes more powerful than our own and we give them authority over our own understanding. And those tools of especially when you come from early trauma of learning how to trust your own voice over other people's voices, that is such an important part. And it's that is empowerment when you're like, no matter what anybody says about me, no matter what anybody else's belief is, who am I underneath all of this? At the end of the day, I know myself. And how do I practice trusting that inner voice and that inner knowing on repeat? Because we're trained out of it from such an early age that we have to kind of unlearn all of these conditioning or pattern or trauma responses and come back to like I actually know my own answers and my own voice underneath it all. But and then to practice hearing that and trusting it is is really important. It's the most important thing. And in my own experience, like that is what grief gave me is an opportunity to learn how to trust myself.
That's you just said that so beautifully. I loved what you said because that's what I learned along my own grief journey is that there's so many people out there, there's so many podcasts, so many books, so many audio tapes, there's self-help gurus across the board. And the common denominator I found on my own journey was that there's so many people out there saying, well, do this and do that and think this way and believe this and this is how you can heal yourself. You can fix yourself in 30 days and the more I read this stuff, I was like, that is complete garbage. Like, who are these people? And the reason I said that was because I started realizing that grief is not something that you're going to get over in a year. I just read about I'm jumping into mental health counseling and a degree, and there's a push for people to get over their grief in 12 months. And I almost laughed inside and said, I've talked to people that have gone through sexual abuse. They would laugh at you if you said, I'm going to get over it in 12 months. They'd laugh at you. If you saw somebody who had a really close husband-wife relationship, for example, and the husband died of a heart attack, they would laugh at you if you said, I'm going to get over it in 12 months. And I started getting to this place, which is why I created the podcast, my podcast, the way I did, why I wrote my book the way I did. I don't want to tell people how to do it because I can't. It's a fallacy. What I think is so powerful is conversations like today of saying, from you as a guest in particular, saying, "Hey, there isn't one way to do it. This is my story. This is how I went through it. This is what I discovered by my own journey and my own path." And for people to listen to those storytelling situations, to people to listen to what resonates versus what doesn't, to take what makes sense, leave what doesn't. I think people are capable when they go through grief and trauma to find their own path. I think they are, but I don't think it's our job to tell people what to do and how to do it. I just don't believe in that. I think that we're there to support and walk beside each other on this journey. And I think that's the true healing power is like you said, we have to unlearn and uncondition ourselves. And through that process, we learn things that resonate with us and connect with us. And that's where the true healing can come in.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Well, Devorah, I just want to say you've been an amazing guest today on this episode. I appreciate you sharing your story. I'm very amazed at where you've came from and who you've become today. And I love that you have taught everybody today that art can be a very powerful outlet in grief healing. And I could not agree with you more about that because art's been very helpful for me. I wanted to ask you as we do wrap up the show, though, if you have any things that you're doing down there in Oregon in particular that you're helping people in the grief community, or if there's a website or social media people could connect with you.
Yeah, I'm on Instagram and Facebook, and it's soulportrait.art is my website. And anybody can reach out to me about this process and use it as a tool to move through grief, to work with yourself rather than against yourself.
Well, for you guys listening today, I'll have her links in the show notes. So when you guys get done watching or listening to this episode, go down there and check out her Instagram and Facebook pages. As you guys have seen today, she's a beautiful, beautiful guest who's got a powerful story and a modality that can help people walk through grief. So I'd love for you to reach out and connect with her when you get the chance. Devorah, thank you so much again for being on the podcast today.
Thanks, Chris. Pleasure.
And I want to thank all of you guys, listeners, for joining Devorah and I today on this episode of the Empowered Grief Journey. If this episode resonates with you, please share it with somebody you know who could benefit from Devorah's story. For more episodes that are designed to empower you and support you during your grief journey, visit empoweredgriefjourney.com and subscribe to this podcast. You can find us on Apple and Podbean and YouTube. The Empowered Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. I want you to know that you're never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.